and they are Mr. Jeff Holliday.
Sorry about that here.
Ms. Jenna Scott.
Hi, I'm here.
All right, and now our voting members, Chair James Lee Stevens.
Here.
Regent Russell Cox. Regent Keith Hamilton. Regent Joe Herdink.
Here.
Regent Barry Martin. And Regent Richard Smith. Okay, so we have two voting members. Is that all we have right now?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, we do not have a quorum. We have to have, to conduct business, we have to have 4 members. We can certainly proceed with hearing, but you cannot actually discuss or vote or take any action during this meeting.
Pam, I will check on the other members just to see if I can find out where they were, because a couple of them had RSVP'd, yes. So let me see if I can figure out where they are.
All right, that would be great.
Yeah, Pam, if we can go ahead and get started information-wise, and I guess until we'll get somebody else on there, Joe and I will be the ones ask most of the questions type of thing is, so we'll go from there. If that's all right with Joe. Okay. All right, Pam.
Then we will skip the approval of the September 6th meeting minutes, since we do not yet have a quorum. And we will take the update from the internal audit for fiscal year 2022-2023.
I want to remind the presenters, I have 3 books in front of me. I have thumbed through the book, so you need to be telling me when we start which book we're looking at so I can follow along, please.
Are you ready for me? This is Lance.
I'm ready for you.
All right. Do you mind if I share my screen, Pam?
Please do, Lance. This is Hannah.
Hannah,
I'm running the screen. No, that's fine. Please take over.
All right. Can you see that?
Yes.
Can everybody's all right. Regent Stevens, just this is the internal audit report. Hopefully you've got one that looks like your screen right now.
I hope so.
All righty. Well,
Lance, I'm sorry. Can I clarify? I want to make sure, Regent Stevens, that the 3 books you were talking about are not the Forvis books. We are currently on the internal audit.
Okay.
And not the external.
All right. Correct. Go ahead. Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, for those on the call who don't know me, my name is Lance Mann. I'm an audit director with Dean Dorton, and we all handle the internal audit services for you all. This is our 2nd report to you during this fiscal year. During this one, we've finished quite a few audits, some that were carried over from Q1 and several for Q2. Here's a summary of the audits we've completed. One was over your FISAP reporting that you're required to do as it relates to student financial aid. We finished 2 business office audits, one in Maysville and one in Henderson. And then in the IT audit space, an audit over access control, an audit over user awareness and training, recovery planning, IT governance and risk assessments, and then protective technologies. In terms of our results, you can see sort of the high-level overview of our results. In the FISAP reporting area, we did not have any findings. We have a low-risk finding to bring to your attention in Maysville and a low-risk finding to bring to your attention in Henderson. And I'm pleased to report in the IT area, we had no findings, which is very good, but from my perspective in doing internal audits for a variety of organizations and IT audit, it is highly rare for us to have 0 findings in the IT space. So your IT group should be applauded for their efforts in implementing good internal controls in their areas. I'm only going to go through the areas where we had findings. I won't necessarily go through the other areas with you, just to be efficient with everyone's time. In Maysville, what we typically do, oh, and I forgot to mention, I've also got Chris Boylan on the call with me today. Chris is the audit manager who leads most of the work for KCTCS. He's actually going to be the one presenting to the board on Friday. But in essence, at each college, we always start by interviewing the college president and the business officer. Sometimes we'll talk to human resources if they have human resources on staff. And then we'll look through the policies and procedures associated with those colleges, look at segregation of duties, look at their cash handling procedures, their asset tagging procedures, the purchasing processes that they have, bank reconciliations, look at their pro card usage, the monthly reporting and budgets and journal entry procedures that they have, really doing a deep dive into things that they can control at the individual colleges. Here at Maysville, we notice 4 very good strengths. One, they do have very good internal controls over cash and cash handling and cash receipts and purchasing. The pro card activity that we looked at here was very well documented and supported within PeopleSoft. The departmental budgeting requests selected for review included good detail and explanations for use of the funds. And the business office internal controls were operating appropriately. So they had very good strengths here. We had one, what we call a low risk finding. In essence, we noticed that the bank reconciliation for 2 of the banks were completed after the date that KCTCS policies require them to be done by. They missed it by 3 days. It's supposed to be done by the 20th of the following month. For their April reconciliation, they didn't finish it until the 23rd of May. And so we've recommended that they train their people, let them know of the policies in place and make sure that they're meeting those appropriate deadlines. They've already completed their remediation plan, which you can see here, with some communication to the employees involved to make sure that they're hitting those deadlines. At Henderson, same process we went through. We've got some good strengths here. They've got 3 employees in the business office there. They have worked very closely with Madisonville to get up to speed on the policies and procedures in place. Their handling of physical cash is very limited. The cash accounts are reconciled timely and money is swept into the main KCTCS operating account within an appropriate amount of time. They've reduced their pro cards on that campus down to 2 cards for the entire college, which makes it a little easier to control spend on pro cards. And they've added another layer of review before purchases can be made. And then the college also has a monthly meeting in place to review budget to actual information with all interested parties to add that layer of accountability for spending within the budget. We had one, what we call a low risk finding here. The college has not historically maintained a signed acknowledgement that the employees who handle cash or oversee cash handling and spending have received and understood the cash handling policies and procedures. We've typically seen a signed acknowledgement. Yes, we understand your policies and procedures. Again, this is a very low risk finding, but we recommended that they add the documentation for the employees who are involved in this process. They've already completed their remediation here. They drafted an acknowledgement letter and sent it to the people involved and had them sign that they understood the policies and procedures in place here. Does anybody have any questions related to our audits? I've got a couple more things to go through with you, but does anybody have any questions so far? All right. 2 more things to go through. So one other part of our audit process is to follow up on prior action plans. So with any finding we have, management will respond to it with how they plan to do things differently in the future. And as a part of your internal audit process, we go back to make sure that they did what they said they were going to do. So during this particular, and most of them get remediated within the next calendar quarter. So going into this audit period, we noted that there were 4 action plans that had not yet been completed in prior audits, and they were completed during these audit plans at the system office. And in the IT space, they had 4 still open. They completed 3 during this one. One of them is not due yet. It'll be due at a future time. And so we also check when they plan to finish theirs. And so they do still have 1 still open in the IT space that will follow up in the next series of audits that we do. As part of the information that was disseminated to you, you've got detail of each of those findings and how they were resolved and if they weren't resolved. The one that is not completed yet relates to disaster recovery information and how it exists in various locations. It needs to be updated to reflect changes made in response to COVID-19. That remediation isn't due until January 31st, 2023. So we'll be following up on it after January 31st, 2023 to make sure that they've done what they've said they were going to do. And then finally, I like to just show you what else we have in process for the rest of this fiscal year based on the audit plan that you all approved at the beginning of the year. We've got 3 audits that are in process from Q2. One relates to Human Resources I-9 audit. We've made our selections there, and we're just waiting to get the data back to test it. The ProCard audit was actually completed this week, but not in time for us to include it in this report, so it'll be in your next report. And then we're looking at your contracting and procedures process for entering into leases. And then starting in January, we've got a series of audits in the human resource space planned over hiring, termination, and status changes, audits over your personal service contracts, making sure that those are properly approved and that you're getting what you're supposed to be paying for there. We'll be doing an audit in the student financial aid space over return to Title IV funds. It's a communication process that you've got to go through with student financial aid. We're going to do a business office audit at both JCTC and Western Kentucky. And then the other one is capital projects audit over approval, budget to actual tracking, final performance, and post-completion usage over any capital projects. And then in April, we'll start your 2024 risk assessment and audit plan development for the next year. And then in the IT space, I won't go through all of these with you, but you can see here, we've got a whole series of IT audits planned over all of KCTCS's information technology and data protection controls over the next 2 quarters. Does anybody have any questions for me? Comments?
Joe, you have a lot of IT stuff, so you ask the questions.
No, it's great, especially on the IT stuff, which, gets me excited. And having no findings this time is amazing. It is nice to see these audits from IT's perspective that it kind of can create a roadmap of where we can get better. I do worry sometimes when there is a lot of items to do. You have a limited staff to tackle those issues, but it looks like they're tackling them just fine. So yeah, looks good.
Yes, I don't have our IT audit group on here. We actually have a 4-person dedicated IT audit group. All they do is IT internal audit. And so they, I don't necessarily understand all the IT stuff, but they do, which is why I have them on our team, and they carry out those for us, led by a guy named Kevin Cornwell.
I noticed that you'd be making some site visits, I think, to J-Town and West Kentucky. Do you expect any more? Are you going to be in the other campuses between now and when you report in June?
We can. So our plan is to hit every college KCTCS has every 4 years.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
1 a quarter every year times 16.
Okay.
So that way they don't feel like they're getting beat up on, and once every 4 years should be adequate enough based on what controls they have in place on campuses versus what's at the system office. We can always increase that or decrease that at the audit committee's direction.
Okay.
If I could,
Go ahead.
Chair Stevens, if I could interrupt, we have Regent Cox and Regent Martin who have joined us. So we now currently have a quorum, and we are able to take action should we need to.
Well, I want to thank Barry and Russell for showing up, but Joe and I were trying to find questions to ask. So thank you all.
You're very welcome.
For some reason, Teams does not want to work for me at all.
Well, technology, Joe, take that under advice, Paul. Russell needs to have better Teams processes. So the next item on the agenda, Pam.
Chair Stevens, are you finished completely, Lance, or did you have another another part of your presentation?
That is my entire presentation.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. We can go back now and approve the minutes for the September 6, 2022 meeting. And we can do this by consensus.
Excuse me, just a moment. Before Lance gets off, I know we'll have another audit meeting like this in the next quarter in January. But Lance, a reminder, I would like to have a representative from your company to report to the board in their June meeting, like you were going to do this time, please.
Yes, sir. So Chris will be presenting this coming Friday to the board. Okay. But I should be at all future quarters. It's every public university in Kentucky, I think, has their board meeting this Friday, and I've got to be at 2 different ones this Friday as well.
Okay, I understand that. We just need to, I know we'll have an audit meeting next quarter sometime by Teams, and we can report out by then but I just like to have a representative there in our June meeting for the full board. Excuse me, Pam, we may go back and pick the minutes up now. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you.
So we can approve these by consensus. So if there are no recommended changes or revisions, we'll take a little hand vote. Okay, it appears there are no revisions and the minutes are approved.
Thank you. All right, Pam.
I think our next agenda item is an update on financial ratios, and I believe that Dr. Malloy and Ms. Hicks will be doing that.
Yes, good afternoon. As background information, the U.S. Department of Education requires all institutions that participate in the Title IV program to complete the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Finance Survey data. The survey collects financial health data of all institutions and asks institutions to calculate and report the components of the 4 key ratios that comprise the composite financial index. Melissa Hicks, the Director of Accounting of KCTCS, will provide an explanation of these 4 ratios, the composite financial index, and she will provide a snapshot of these ratios, the CFI of the KCTCS system office and colleges as of June 30th, 2022. Melissa?
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so you're going to take care of that. I can share my screen or you can operate it.
You can share, Melissa. That's usually easier if you would like to
Okay.
share.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay. Okay, so financial ratios for higher education institutions. This presentation is based on a reference manual called Strategic Financial Analysis for Higher Education. It's the 7th edition of the manual, and it was issued in 2010. It was published by Prager and Company, and KPMG was responsible for the material in addition to this Prager, Seeley and Company. Let's see. Okay, so as many of you know, a financial ratio is just a tool that can be used as part of strategic financial analysis, and this includes the function of planning and forecasting. Ratios should be considered within the context of the mission, and they help us to understand the financial health of an organization so that we can develop strategies to manage risk and ultimately achieve the mission. Keep in mind that we do strive for financial health of the institution, but we are not necessarily striving to meet a threshold for the sake of the threshold. The authors of the reference manual did develop thresholds for each of the ratios and for the CFI. But the point is that we're not necessarily striving to meet the threshold just for the sake of the threshold. The point is that we are trying to improve the financial health of the organization. So, and that should be interpreted within the context of the strategic plan and strategic objectives. So the score may fluctuate based on your strategic decisions that you've made, but you should understand your scores and be moving toward better financial health as a result of your strategic decisions. So the Composite Financial Index, or the CFI, is, as Beverly pointed out, a commonly used measure for higher education institutions. It's comprised of 4 core ratios, 2 of which are wealth ratios and 2 are operational ratios. The wealth ratios take into account a long-term perspective of the organization, while the operational ratios take into more of a short-term perspective. The 2 wealth ratios are the primary reserve and the viability ratio, and the operational ratios are the return on net assets and net operating revenues. The CFI is considered to be a holistic measure because, again, it takes into account both short-term and long-term perspectives of the organization, and it includes metrics that are key to the financial health of the organization. So we'll briefly take a look at each ratio and the CFI, talk about what the measure reports, discuss key questions answered by each measure, and then discuss the threshold for each measure. Again, although the authors developed thresholds or bright lines for each measure, the right level is institution specific, and this is something that is included throughout the reference manual that this presentation was based on. The threshold just shows the industry standard or the recommended score. Institutions should develop targets that balance their financial, operating, and programmatic objectives. So the first of the ratios is the primary reserve ratio. And you can see in the top right of your screen how this ratio is calculated. It reports financial strength, and it's in some degrees a measure of liquidity. It shows expenses that are covered by expendable assets, and It speaks to the sufficiency and flexibility of resources of the organization. Specifically, it asks how long, or answers how long can the institution function using expendable reserves. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because I would like to point out that the key questions, many of the key questions that are addressed by these ratios are predictive in nature, and this speaks to the forecasting and planning attribute of the ratios. Okay, there we go. So what you'll see next is an actual example, and this was taken from the reference manual, and this is just an example calculation. It shows that you would take your unrestricted net assets, add expendable restricted net assets, and then the next three items, KCTCS does not have component units, so we don't have to worry about those lines. And then you would total your expendable net assets and divide that by your total expenses. And then that gives you the primary reserve ratio. The authors recommend a threshold of 0.4 or greater, noting that this means that the institution could cover about 5 months of expenses using its reserves. Typically, institutions at this level are relying more on internal cash flow to meet short-term needs. They're able to carry on a reasonable level of facilities maintenance and usually able to manage unforeseen financial events. The second ratio is the viability ratio, and this ratio, you can see the calculation again in the top right of your screen. It reports debt capacity, which is basically showing us debt that can be covered by expendable assets. It again speaks to the sufficiency of resources, but with regard to debt. And notice that the key questions that this ratio addresses are forward-looking. It can tell you whether or not there's room for more debt to support your mission, whether or not you should reduce debt in order to remain viable. Here we have an example calculation for the viability ratio, and again, we would ignore for KCTCS, we would not have component unit lines. You would calculate the numerator in exactly the same manner as the primary reserve ratio, and the denominator is your plant-related debt, which for KCTCS is our leases and our Build Smart debt primarily. So the recommended threshold for this is 1.25 or greater. At this level, institutions are considered to be more self-reliant and have more operating flexibility. The next ratio is the return on net assets. Again, you can see the calculation in the upper right-hand screen. This one reports economic return on assets, and the authors recommend using a 3 to 5 year rolling average to calculate this. And the reason that they recommend that is to really smooth out the score on this ratio. Since this is an operational ratio, there could be spikes in the score because you're looking at the change in net assets for each year divided by the total beginning net assets. So, you know, depending on how you do in one particular year, you might have a spike or you might have a dip. And so using a 3 year rolling average to calculate this ratio would really kind of smooth out that effect. This ratio answers at what level are the institution's assets obtaining returns that can be reinvested? Threshold of 0.06 or greater is recommended. And then again, you can see the example calculation here, just coming up with what the total numerator and total denominator is. And again, as a ratio calculation, just dividing one by the other. So the final ratio is the net operating reserves ratio. Again, you can see the calculation in the upper right hand of the screen. This ratio reports the rate of surplus or deficit, and it does impact the other three core ratios. So keep that in mind. It addresses at what level did the institution achieve a surplus, and is the institution living within available resources. A recommended threshold of 0.04 or greater is recommended. And an example illustration shown here. Again, just calculating the numerator and denominator using those components. Okay, so the composite financial index, it reports overall organizational financial health. And as mentioned earlier, it is a combined measure of the four core ratios, and that's why it's considered to be a holistic measure. Weaknesses and strengths in one of the four core ratios then are offset by the others when combined. So 3 key points that I want to make about the CFI. The first one is that it does not include consideration of deferred maintenance. So if you have an institution, if you're comparing two institutions, one of them has a lot of deferred maintenance, one does not. But the one that does not have a lot of deferred maintenance maybe has a lower CFI score. The one that has a lot of deferred maintenance may have a higher CFI score. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's in better financial health, because that deferred maintenance is not being taken into account in this metric. The second point is that all ratios, including the CFI, should be considered over several years and looking at trends and how you're growing over time. And then finally, and I've said this before, and it's really emphasized throughout the reference manual, is that the ratios do need to be analyzed in context with other activities and plans. So it's not, again, just trying to meet a score just for the sake of meeting that score. It should be that you understand what your score is, you understand how you got to that score, whether or not you made strategic decisions that would have caused your, for example, your unrestricted reserves to go down, and then how you expect those strategic decisions to impact your scores going forward. And that kind of helps you to manage your financial health a little bit better and really more on a holistic basis, considering not just how you perform in each fiscal year, but taking into account, your entire balance sheet and cumulatively how you've done. So the composite financial index is the most complicated of the ratios to compute. It considers the strength of the ratios, and the calculation converts each ratio to a common scale. That strength factor base was developed by the authors, and it was based on their experience as to what makes a higher education institution financially healthy. So you convert each ratio to a common scale called a strength factor, and then the CFI also considers the relative importance of the ratios because it weights those factors. The recommended weights are shown on screen with the primary reserve, the viability ratio being weighted more heavily, and the operational ratios weighted less heavily. So again, it just tells you whether or not your organization is considered financially healthy in accordance with this industry standard. A threshold of 3 or greater is recommended. And here you'll see an example calculation. This shows the ratio score. Then you would divide it by the strength factor base, take that number, multiply it by the weighting factor, and then you would have your weighted score. So after calculating these ratios, the next step would be to analyze them within the context of your strategic plan and objectives, establish goals, monitor, reevaluate. And here we have a picture of a snapshot of what the ratios are as of 6/30/22 for KCTCS as a whole and for each of the colleges. Note that, again, a reminder that these scores should be considered within the context of other activities. And I will say that these scores were computed with the impact of GASB 68 and 75. So I do have the calculations that remove the impact of 68 and 75. That was a recommendation from NACUBO that 68 and 75 be excluded from those calculations. So I have that information that I can send to you all, and it does change the scores somewhat. Basically, removing GASB 68 and 75 effect generally increases the CFI score, and it decreases the return on net asset score calculated based on a single year. It generally decreases the score across the board because for KCTCS for the last few years, we've actually had pension and OPEB income. So when we remove the effect of the pension and OPEB income from this ratio, it reduces the ratio overall. So, you know, GASB 68 and 75, we typically, although it's required to include those in audited financial statements, we do prepare every year financial statements without the impact of GASB 68 and 75 because those numbers are long-term liabilities and they fluctuate rather significantly from year to year based on changes in assumptions and changes in discount rates, changes in the healthcare trend rates and that kind of thing. So we do prepare financial statements for internal use without the effect of GASB 68 and 75. So we will prepare those ratios. We have those ready and we can send those out to you.
Melissa, in reference, James Stevens, in reference to that
Yeah.
chart you're showing us now,
Mhm.
does that mean that the ones that are highlighted in yellow or gold do not meet the threshold criteria?
Yes, that's correct. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are falling below the threshold, and the ones in green are at the threshold or greater. And, keep in mind, though, that since this is the first time that we're calculating these ratios, we need to take a look at how we ended up where we are. How did we get the score that we got? And we need to consider, okay, did we arrive at that score because of specific strategic decisions that were made? In most cases, that I would think that the answer to that would be yes, we understand how we got to where we are, but perhaps there are things that we can do to impact these ratios that would improve the financial health of the organization as a whole, of the institutions as a whole. These ratios give us a more holistic way of evaluating and managing institutions rather than just looking at budget versus actual. What these ratios do is they take into account components of the financial statements that are long-term in nature and that are based on accrual-based accounting. And so they really give us a better understanding of how the institution is doing in a more holistic manner.
Two additional questions for you is every public institution in the state secondary education required to do this report and report it out?
I do know that IPEDS is calculating these ratios based on information that is provided to IPEDS. I do not know if every public institution in the state is calculating these, but we could definitely send, we have a group within the state, and we also have people that participate from Tennessee in our group, and I could definitely send an email to them to see if everyone is calculating these.
This is an instrument so that we can identify areas of strength and weaknesses and get better. Am I correct in that? And there's no, if you do not meet a certain criteria, there's no punitive damage to the institution or the system. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. This is just a management tool, and it's something that should be, like I said, evaluated and considered within the context of your strategic plan and objectives.
Paul, you had a comment? Dr. Sarapati, you had a comment?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Yes, I think what would be helpful to provide a little bit more context on this is to go a few years back before COVID, during COVID, and then now to show what's been happening, because I think we're going to see great fluctuations based on what projects the colleges are taking on, construction, things like that, asset preservation. There's a lot of things that go into these things that just looking at a single year might not give us the best advice on. And thank you very much for putting this together.
You're certainly welcome.
Hannah, you had a question or comment?
Yes, thank you, Chair Stevens. I actually am going to defer to Regent Herdink if he wants to bring up the question that he had before the committee meeting. And he had asked me to send something out to the committee, but I did not get it out in time before we met today. So I wanted to give him a chance to present it and present the answer he was presented with for his question, and I can help with that if I need to. Regent Herdink.
Yes, when I first got this document, I was looking through it, and I was like trying to pick out what's missing in some of these financial ratios. And I just noticed that the system office was not included in these ratios. So I asked the question, why? It's because system office doesn't have financial statements generated. So that led to the next question, why do the colleges have them generated if the system office doesn't, which do as a whole? Because Dr. Moy informed me that each institution has Title IV responsibilities for financial aid. So they must generate these financial statements. And that was basically what I was going. I didn't see them in there. I was just kind of wondering why. And I really appreciate you getting those answers to me quickly.
And I'll go back to Dr. Zarapato again. I think this is good information, but Paul, sometimes we're very sensitive to see things for the first time and say, oh my goodness, are we in trouble or this and that? So, I don't know how much of this is to present. It is worthwhile information, but I don't want us to be, after your comment, alarmed and spend a tremendous amount of time on this. Your comments, Paul?
Yeah, I think we can certainly give an update on this. I think when we can see this over a time horizon, like I said, I think, if we can look at this year, we know during COVID, our revenues were inflated, and then maybe we go a couple years back then. So maybe now and 4 years prior, 5 years prior, I think that will give us a much better story. Just because I know, you can take a look at this, and I can look, and and some of the composite financial indexes are real high. My guess is because they've gotten a lot of money from the state for capital construction projects. I mean, but there's other reasons too. And again, it really depends college by college. So, but I would agree with that. I don't think there's cause for alarm as a system. We're very strong. That's one of the benefits of a system is weathering these types of storms.
Joe, you had a comment?
Oh yeah, just the same thing. I wouldn't mind seeing in our next quarter meeting or whatever the previous year's information as well. Just that'd be neat to see. Also, a second question I had written down, just because I don't know, our budget reserve money, that's not an asset, that's an expense, correct, in these calculations?
Your budget reserve would be part of your net position, and so that would be included in the numerator for the primary reserve and the viability. So that's where that would show up. It wouldn't show up as an expense.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. I was just wondering that.
Mm-hmm.
And as it relates to looking at the trend over time, Melissa is preparing these ratios for 5 years for each school.
Perfect. Thank you.
And reference, Paul, I know the Huron report is a big deal, but I want to be sure that we spend an adequate amount of time, you and Dr. Moy, is what we need on this, and don't become obsessed with these gold or yellow things sometimes that we see. Paul?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think this is good information to get out to the board about these, the 4 ratios, and then of course the composite financial index that we're looking at these things. But it's certainly, this is just shining light on more information, which is great. I think it's a good thing.
Thank you. Any other comments? Pam?
All right. We are ready. If there are no further comments on this, we are ready to move to the next agenda item, which would be the external audit for fiscal year 2021 and 2022. And I believe our external auditors from Forvis are here to present.
Yes, we are. Thanks, Pam. Hannah, I guess it is okay if I share my screen as well?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay. Great.
Just be sure you refer to which books since I've got the 3 books here, so I want to make sure I get the right one. Okay.
Okay. Will do, Chair Stevens. I appreciate that. And I also have Mary McKinley with me today. She is a partner on the account as well. So she is with me to help with the presentation today. But we are glad to be here to present to you. So Chair Stevens, I have a presentation that I put together. Hopefully everybody can see that on their screen currently.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'm not sure if you had those in your book, Chair Stevens. I know there are the audit report, the audit committee letter, and then the single audit report. So I know there's a lot of pages with the audit report and the audit committee letter. So the goal for me today was to summarize it in this presentation to give you the high level results of the external audit. So that is the goal today, but please interrupt me at any point in time that you have questions on any of the slides that I have, and I will answer those questions. So here again is the agenda. We are going to go over the audit results, a few financial statement highlights that are noted in the external audit report, the audit committee letter, and then any questions that you have. So the audit results, I'd like to first off thank everybody at KCTCS. I know most of management is on the call with Melissa doing a great presentation with the ratios, kind of dives right into this financial result. So big thank you to Melissa, Buddy, David, and Beverly and the team there, because it was our first year as Forvis as the audit firm. And so we were able to accomplish our audit plan and our timeline. So that is a big item to do that first year as a new audit firm. So we appreciate management's patience and working with us to accomplish that timeline. We have issued an unmodified clean opinion on the financial statements. You may note in the opinion there is an emphasis of matter, and that was for the adoption of GASB 87. So there were no errors or issues to note with that, but because that was a new standard and it was a significant change on the financial statements, and I can kind of explain the nature of that, we did put an emphasis of matter in the opinion for that. Very positive as there is no significant deficiencies or material weaknesses in internal control over financial reporting or on your compliance noted. So there were no internal control matters to report to you today. And then as I noted, we adopted GASB 87 during this fiscal year. One item to note when you looked at the financial statements, you may have noticed they were not comparative. And because the way GASB had written 87, you have to present that as the earliest year presented. And so a single year was much more reasonable for the presentation. Going backwards a year, maybe it was not as beneficial, and it was a lot of work to go back a year. And most of the nature of your change in GASB 87 was really your capital leases became a notes payable. The impact was we added an asset and a liability for $14.2 million. So there wasn't a significant change to your increase or decrease in net position. It was a lot of terminology that changed in the financial statement. So just kind of wanted to provide that background with GASB 87 and some of the items you might have noted in the financial statements. A few financial statement highlights here. You'll see we just noted that the net tuition, there was a slight decrease in the overall net tuition, about a 3% decline. Again, we continue to see these fluctuate as everybody comes back from the pandemic, and some people are coming back to school, some are not, and going through that fluctuation. The net position stayed very strong, an increase of 15%, about 127 million there. And then the state appropriations did increase as well. So about 13 million increase to about 184 million during the year. Here gives you a summarized financial highlights on the statement of net position. I know this one might be a little small here. So this just gives you high-level summary of some of the items on that impacted that 127 million. So cash and restricted cash was increased. Most of that related to appropriations for capital projects, as well as the CARES and your ARPA and that COVID money that was coming through the financials as well. As you'll see here, I did add a line for lease assets and capital assets. As you notice, the change from the prior year did not fluctuate significantly. So again, some terminology is really what changed here on that balance sheet. And so you'll see here's that 128 million. So again, that was a capital lease, and now it's shown as notes payable. So really, again, GASB 87 adoption was terminology that impacted. So again, the primary increase in the total assets are the cash increase, as well as there was an OPEB asset that increased substantially as well. So those are the two primary drivers of that. And then you'll see here then that 127 increase in net position there. And so a lot is driven by the decrease in the pension and OPEB liability. And as Melissa noted, those change substantially with various assumptions that go into it, with your discount rate, with the investment return, the amortization period. So there's a lot of things, as you all are well aware of, with 68 and 75 that can really fluctuate those numbers quite a bit, and kind of, and like Melissa said, can impact those ratios depending on how those numbers are fluctuating. Here it just gives you some highlights on the statement of revenues and expenses. So again, the federal and state grants, that number is increased, primarily driven by the COVID funding that has been received, which again has been very helpful to offset those operating expenses that have increased, due to various items and, having to have more protective gear and just different things that you had to do and put in place for the pandemic. So again, you did have different expenses that you had post with that. You will say here is the operating revenues and the expenses. Again, you do have the offset with the non-operating. So with the GASB presentation, you have the state appropriations as well as the capital grants that are what we say below the line, if you will. And so those are the non-operating that, again, overall shows the 127 million increase in that position. Financial statement footnote highlights. Again, it's a lengthy report with the required information with the pension that does give you a lot of the information with the assumptions and the actuarial changes. A couple items just wanted to point out in note 5, there's a new table for lease assets. So you are used to seeing one table that shows the capital assets. You do have those now segregated between those assets that are under a lease and those that are what you own or those capital assets. And then note 7 is a disclosure that is now says notes payable, those prior capital leases that I touched upon. We did perform the audit, the financial statement audit, as well as the uniform guidance audit. So here, again, we had no findings as it related to the compliance audit as well. The major programs that we did test were the Student Financial Assistance Cluster, the Education Stabilization Fund, or the HERF, Perkins 5, and then the Coronavirus State, Local, and Fiscal Recovery Funds. So unfortunately, the coronavirus, that one, the government has made that high risk along with the HERF. And so they keep telling us we have to test that one. So as long as that money is spent and the compliance supplement says that's high risk, that one will have to be tested as long as it meets a threshold. Any questions on the financial statements, the audit opinion before I go into the audit committee letter?
I have a statement. Maybe Buddy can answer. Those COVID funds, can you inform, you're Beverly one, of when those are supposed to expire? I know some of them have a certain date on it or so. So when is it required that all of those funds may be used? If you can just report that out sometime, that and how much, approximately how much money is there left in those COVID funds, and then how much when we have to spend it by. Thank you.
You're welcome. I get that data for you.
I know Chair Stevens, in the audit report, we had noted there was about 9.7 million left to spend. So again, that was at June 30th, and when we dated those in October. So that's approximate amount that we had seen that was unspent as of that date.
Yeah, and I was just concerned about, I know it has a restriction time limit on it, so I want to be sure that we spend all the money that it's appropriately goes to where it's supposed to, but we do not give any money back to them, is what I'm saying. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. Okay. So under the audit committee letter here, this is our required communication to you all today. And so this first item just notes that we, our auditor's responsibility and to perform under the generally accepted accounting principles. And so we did issue an unmodified opinion on the financial statements. Next item here is discussing the significant accounting policies, and those are described in note 1 into the financial statements. There were no unusual accounting policies or accounting methods that we noted used by the system. As I discussed, that GASB 87 was adopted during the year, so that was effective as July 1st, 2021. And so again, really what that does is you recognize the leases for both lessees and lessors on the financial statements. And so they basically are all on the net position now. And then the statement of activities, you no longer report rent expense for the previously classified operating leases, but instead you have interest expense on the liability and amortization expense related to the asset. So really just what we call geography, kind of movement of where those are associated on those statements. Again, no matters to report from any alternative accounting treatments. And then management's judgments and accounting estimates. So these are inherent in the financial statements. And so items that we just pay particular attention to during the audit process because there are estimates involved. And so we looked at the valuation of the investment securities. Those are at net asset value. So we do third-party confirmations and look at those values and compare those to other estimates. No issues that were noted. Then again, the defined benefit pension plan and other post-employment benefit assumptions. Again, we obtain the actuary reports and those information to support the information that management includes in the financial statements. So we look at those and those assumptions and test those to other items. And then we also look for the allowance for uncollectible receivables. Is there any management's bias or any unusual items noted in the allowance? So again, on either of those items, no items to report to you today or any adjustments that we had. Financial statement disclosures. Again, I talked about GASB 87. Again, these are just judgments that are related to these. No items noted. The alternative investments, the net asset value is noted in the investment footnote. The post-employment benefit plan and the long-term disability plan. And then again, we have the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. So we have the COVID-19 footnote that again provides detail on the funds that were spent during the year. Again, there were no audit adjustments that Forvis proposed to the financials that management provided, and we had no current year past adjustment. So a past adjustment is item that maybe management and the audit firm deem are immaterial, and we don't record those on the financials, but we give an impact. So we did not have any. There was one from the prior year that we looked at when we acknowledge the prior year financial statements and we look at those work papers with the prior audit firm. And so there was a past adjustment that they had noted related to the HERF funding, and that was due to timing. So again, we didn't have any other timing items that we had noted when we had performed the audit process this year. Next page, again, we had no matters to report about any judgments about the quality of the system's accounting policies. The other communication we had was we did have a representation letter that management signs when we issue the financial statements. We had no significant items that we discussed with management during the audit process. One internal control matter that we did have over compliance was related to the supporting documentation for the HERF reporting. So this was an item as we were looking at the quarterly reports that had to be uploaded for the student portion. The information was able to be provided to us. However, it wasn't readily available. So I know some of these are more timing and information gets uploaded online. And I think the actual documents that were used to support that upload of information may not have been kept for all of the updates. And so again, we just note when you are making those, sometimes it's a point in time. And so when you run that data, it's available that day you post it. Just make sure to maintain that data so that when you have to present that or show that as support for information, you upload it. So again, that was just one item we had noted in our internal control over compliance related to the HERF reporting. And those were the prepared comments. So I don't know if others have questions on the financial statements as well as the audit committee letter.
Anybody have
My
any?
perspective, everything looks good. I appreciate the thorough nature
Thanks,
of
Dr.
the
Fox.
report.
Yes, thank you.
No findings are good findings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No bad comments or all good comments.
Yeah, that was much better said than I said. Well, yeah, we've come a long way. I can remember 10 years ago or so where there was pages of them. Well, probably further out than that, but
Since we still have Buddy on the line and Beverly, is that which one of these help me? Which one of these? How often is the college's bank accounts, internal accounts checked? Are they checked yearly by Buddy, your staff, or the auditors or so? I know each one of them has a bank account.
So the bank accounts are reconciled on a monthly basis. They are also double checked by our internal auditor, which Lance Bass Lance had just mentioned. One of our colleges was a couple of days late in getting the bank reconciled. And then I can turn it over to Melissa or Mr. Atkins in regards to Forvis to see what they do in regards to bank reconciliation, because I'm not familiar with their steps.
And I would assume that do most of the colleges just have one bank account, or they have multiple bank accounts?
There are several colleges that have multiple bank accounts due to the location of where they're located, and the same bank is not in each of those locations. But okay. I can get you the detail of all the banks we have.
No, I was just wondering, but all of those bank accounts are audited on an annual basis or reviewed on an annual basis, right?
They're reviewed monthly and annually, yes.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Chair Stevens, we did 4 site visits. So we looked at Pro Cards and some cash reconciliations at 4 sites. So we went to West Kentucky, South Central, Big Sandy, and Ashland. So we did some cash receipt sample selections as well as some Pro Card sample selections.
Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions for the auditors or Buddy or Paul or Joe or anybody's on the line?
Not from me. It's very thorough.
I thought both of the reports are excellent. Auditors have done a great job presenting to us, and I'm sure they'll do a great job presenting to the board. Ms. Duncan, I'll turn it back to you.
So Chair Stevens, at this time, because they both the internal and external auditors will be presenting to the full board, there is not a need, unless you feel compelled to do so, to make any recommendations to the full board, since they will be hearing the same presentation as you just heard.
I would just like to say is that, I always like to have I think it's important to have committees to say yay or nay. So basically it's up to the committee, but I am very impressed with the reports, both of them, and very thorough, and it was very well explained. And, I would entertain a motion, if so desired is, that we accept the report and present it to the full board as presented.
So moved.
I'll second it. This is Barry.
All right, if all voting members have their cameras on and their audio on as well, we can take a vote. But first, we will ask our advisory members whether they have any comments, and we'll begin with Mr. Holliday.
I thought it was a very well detailed presentation from both our internal and external auditors. And our in-house, I look forward to seeing more of the CFI numbers in the future. I think those could be really, really helpful, but I was really pleased with the internal and external auditors reports.
And Ms. Scott?
Yeah, I was really impressed as well. And I also appreciated Mr. Mann explaining some of the policies that KCTCS has for the business offices, what was analyzed as part of the audit, Jennifer with the external audit presentation, all of the assumptions that kind of changed where some of the numbers moved around. I really appreciated that explanation. And like Jeff just said, I think trying to expand and use the data that's available to you all to answer some questions, look forward, as we plan ahead, I think that's very helpful as well for the college.
Thank you. We will take the vote now. If all voting members, please have your cameras on. Chair Stevens.
Aye.
Regent Cox.
Yes.
Regent Herding.
Yes.
Regent Martin.
Yes.
The vote is unanimous. The proposition to recommend the reports to the full board carries.
Any other questions or comments? We have any other business, Ms. Duncan?
No, we are adjourned. If we have a motion, a second, and consensus.
I'll be glad to entertain a motion. We adjourn and see everybody Thursday.
See you.
Second.
Thanks,
Have a
everybody.
good night.
Good.
Good night.
Thanks. See y'all Thursday.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. See you.
Thank you. Bye.